Good afternoon friends and welcome to EduSite Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to discuss about India's foreign policy and the topic for discussion is From Post-Colonial to the Aspiring Power, Evolution of Indian Foreign Policy. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is an associate professor in Aryabhat College in University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has 25 years of teaching experience and his area of expertise is Indian foreign policy, Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jha to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you and good afternoon. In fact, today's lecture we are going to have on India's foreign policy, particularly from post-colonial to the stature or status of aspiring power. Now, this entire discussion would revolve around this issue of the evolution of India's foreign policy, that how it has taken a long, trajectory, through basically 5-6 decades, in which it has basically grown to a position where now it is being discussed, or it is being discussed, or it is being stated all around that India aspires to be a global power. So basically, this is something we have to take into account while looking at this theme. Now, coming to this issue of India's evolution from post-colonial to aspiring power. In fact, what we have to discuss that how at the time of independence, how India's position in the Committee of Nations, how it was placed, what were the constraints, what were the factors which basically impinged on India's foreign policy, because as it is well known that foreign policy is decided by any country in context of certain domestic factors. In fact, the domestic factors which are normally known as determinants of India's determinants of foreign policy, they play important role. Now, those determinants are basically factorized in articulating a country's policy vis-a-vis other nations, which we normally known as foreign policy. What happened that over the last 6 decades, those determinants are there. No one can deny the role or existence of those determinants, but there have been some changes in those factors over the years, because after all, foreign policy of any country seeks to promote national interests. India is no exception. And when we talk of national interest is sum total of those interests of a country which evolve over a long period of time, and some of those interests change, keep changing, but there are some elements in national interest which never change. So, they basically is a combination of both the static and the dynamic factors. If you look at the India's foreign policy, then we find that there are certain national interests which have not changed over the ages. For example, unity, integrity of a country is one national interest which, irrespective of the political party or ideology which comes to power here, would basically subscribe to that principle and would like to promote and protect that interest. But then there are certain interests which keep changing. So is the case with the determinant. There are certain determinants, for example, the geostrategic considerations which go into the making of foreign policy, the geographical determinant that cannot change very rapidly. But then there are other determinants which keep changing. For example, the economic prosperity or the economic condition of a country, that keeps changing. And all these factors get reflected in the formulation of foreign policy for any country, whether India or United States of America or Britain, or for that matter any other country. So, determinants always play important role, and domestic factors are perhaps the most important determinants of foreign policy. Now, what happens that India's story and the Indian story, one can say, is quite interesting, in the sense that India started as a post-colonial nation. Got independence in 1947 after a long period in which India was subjugated to colonial rule. India was under British rule. After long struggle, freedom struggle, India got independence in 1947. Because of more than 200 years of colonial rule, India's economic condition was quite precarious. India was reeling under poverty, there was illiteracy, it was underdeveloped economy, agriculture and industry both were underdeveloped, and therefore India's condition, one can say, was a condition of a underdeveloped economy, and so on and so forth. So that was one important factor. But second thing, and which is also equally important, the international situation, the international environment. And here we find that India's independence coincided with the onset of Cold War. In fact, it was not a third world war, but in fact after the experience of the two world wars, the world was caught into this ideological battle between the two camps. One led by Soviet Union, another by United States of America. And these two camps, the ideological rivalry which took place, and which has been known as Cold War, basically gripped the entire world, and the clouds of the Third World War were also on the horizon. So that was not a very healthy development so far as these developing nations who had got independence after long colonial rule is concerned. Because this ideological rivalry between the two camps led to a situation where there was polarization, there was a camp building, there were camp followers, and every country was being persuaded to join one camp or the other, sometimes in name of ideology, sometimes in name of the national interest. But that was another important development which basically India had to address at that time. And it was in this context that India's foreign policy becomes quite significant here as a post-colonial nation. That what were India's priorities, what was India's national interest, that had to be factored in. And India did it, and perhaps decided to formulate its foreign policy which best suited its national interest. And it is here the role of India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru becomes important. He was not only the architect of India's foreign policy at that time, but his imprint on India's foreign policy for next 2 decades remain quite visible. Of course, a leadership plays important role from time to time. It is not India's first Prime Minister, but even the subsequent Prime Ministers have played important role, and we will come back to this issue later. But India's first Prime Minister is remembered because it was that situation in which India was basically caught unaware. That was the Cold War, and the challenges, the domestic front, that is basically the problem of development, the problem of malnutrition, the problem of illiteracy, the problem of the social strife, largely on account of the partition of the country. So all these factors impinged on India's India, and therefore India's leadership had to address these concerns. So therefore, in international situation, how India would address these concerns, how India would place itself, how India would basically look at the unfolding scenario, this was the question at that time. And India not only did it, but did it with a lot of perfection, so much so that in course of time India became the leader of a new bloc which became famous as the Third World Bloc, which gradually merged into this movement which also got popular in name of non-aligned movement. We will also discuss this issue, that how non-aligned movement got shaped, or what was basically the issue at hand. So this was the situation. Now therefore, what we should remember, that the role of India's first Prime Minister Nehru here. Now it is also true that India's foreign policy didn't only start with Nehru, but it had a background in the past also. And when we talk of determinants of foreign policy, it is not only domestic factors, but even historical factors. They also play important role. For example, if India has believed in non-violence, if India has believed in peace, if India has believed in other values, in fact those principles are largely on account of the fact that they are the legacy of Indian history, Indian culture, Indian tradition. From traditionally, we believe that India has basically preached and practiced non-violence. India has believed in peace, and India has believed in global order based on democracy and other principles. Therefore, they get reflected in India's foreign policy. So, one can say that India's foreign policy articulates some of the legacies of Indian history, Indian tradition, Indian culture. But nonetheless, one should not completely ignore the role of India's leadership at the time of independence. And that leadership, when we talk of leadership, it basically we are referring to India's first Prime Minister Nehru, particularly in terms of basically designing and devising or basically promoting this entire principle of non-alignment. That why this non-alignment became important at that time. Of course, we should also remember that non-aligned movement, which was formally launched in 1961 in Belgrade, didn't start in that shape. It had a different, altogether different beginning. In fact, one can say that its beginning was made in 1947 in Asian Relations Conference, which was held in New Delhi. Now, that was basically a conference meant to force new solidarity with Asian nations, because many other Asian countries had also struggled against colonial rule, and they had acquired independence, and therefore India realized that because of the common bond they shared because of their Asian origin, these countries should come together and basically take a common stand on global issues. So, Asian Relations Conference was held in 1947, but that didn't stop there. If you had 1947 Asian Relations Conference, then 1955 we had the Bandung Conference, 1955 Afro-Asian conference. Now, from Asian we basically moved to a new terrain, that is Africa-Asia, Afro-Asian. So, now there is an attempt to on the part of India to basically bring together many countries of Africa and Asia, the two continents who were basically the worst victim of this colonialism and imperialism and racism. So, therefore, now an attempt goes slightly further, and from Asian relations we move to Afro-Asian solidarity, that is 1955 Bandung. From 1955 we move to the next stage in 1961, when you have the formal launching of non-aligned movement, and this is in Belgrade. So, what happens there? Now, from Asia we move to Asia Africa, and from Asia Africa now we are moving for Asia Africa and Latin America, the new bloc, the new configuration of power, that is the non-aligned movement. So, therefore, what I was basically mentioning here, that this entire non-aligned movement has to be contextualized, it has to be historicized, that how it started. It was not just accidental development. It was not simply the process which started in 1961, but once its background can be traced to 1947, even before 1947, when basically the Second World War was going on, and India at that time was not independent, but Indian National Congress, which was spearheading this movement, was taking a firm stand on many international issues, including the fight between democracy and fascism and so on and so forth. And Nehru, as the leader of Congress, used to basically play important role in formulation of those policies of the Congress. So, therefore, one can see also some continuity between what Congress was doing before independence, what India decided to do through its foreign policy after independence, because Nehru became India's first Prime Minister. So, this was the situation. Now, I mean, what were the options before India at that time as a post-colonial state? Options were very limited. India required a lot of assistance from different powers. India required a lot of support from different countries of the world, including West as well as the Eastern Bloc. Now, when we talk of West and East, normally we refer to that ideological rivalry which was going on between the United States of America led Western countries, who basically believed that they had a liberal democratic system which guaranteed freedom, democracy, etc., and the Eastern Bloc, which championed the cause of socialism, and it was being led by Soviet Union, which believed that this entire Western campaign or Western slogan of democracy was fake and false, and therefore it was basically a kind of garb in which imperialist interests were being promoted. So, therefore, this entire fight between the East and West, which basically converged into this Cold War politics, was the order of the day. So, what were basically India's options at that time, and what were India's priorities? The two important priorities which India had at that time: number one, that India wanted support or assistance from different quarters in order to basically concentrate on India's economic development, because that was perhaps the most important issue that had to be addressed. Now, when we talk of economic development, or when we talk of the development, we basically mean number of things. Indian economy was in shambles. India didn't have industrialization. India's agriculture needed to be modernized. India lacked scientific know-how. There was no technological base. Scientific research had to be promoted, and all these required a lot of resources which India lacked at that time. The two dominant models of industrialization which were prevalent at that time, one was this industrial revolution model, which was basically the model on basis of which the entire West had developed, which basically believed in primitive accumulation or using agriculture as a kind of supplier of resources for industrialization, or the Soviet model, as it later on popularly was called, also basically had the same framework to deal with resource mobilization, which economists call primitive accumulation. And in both cases, what happened, that it was forcibly done. If in Western Europe it was it has had the history of enclosure movement, in the Soviet model we have heard about collectivization and so on and so forth. But India didn't have that option or didn't have that luxury. Apart from that, the Western powers had also used the resources through colonial rule, colonialism. India also didn't have that option. So therefore, options were limited. India had to look for resources, and resources through democratic means. India was the only country in the world which had given universal adult franchise at with the at the time of independence. In other countries of the world, as we know, it had come in bits and pieces in installments. So that was one strength, as well as another, in another sense one can say also weakness, because India India couldn't afford to forcibly mobilize resources by taking to this primitive accumulation, by subjecting those who were associated with agriculture to repression, the way enclosure movement and collectivization had done. So therefore, resource mobilization had to be done. There is no denying this fact, but resource mobilization had to be done democratically, and this was a big challenge. And India therefore had to find out a different route, a route which would not basically resemble with West or the East. That was basically on front of development. The another thing was that India also had to take a call on this Cold War politics, because joining Cold War politics at that time meant that a country had to go for arms race, or basically armaments or preparation of arms and ammunitions, because this is how this Cold War was basically this is how the Cold War was going on. So therefore, India's choice was also limited on this front, because if India joined the Cold War politics, then of course it had to be a camp follower of one camp or the other, and then there was no getting away, or there was no escape from this arms race. But India wanted to concentrate on its development, on its developmental priorities. India wanted to create a situation where Indians who were malnourished, or basically who were illiterate or who were poor, were properly treated, or they got the opportunity for their development. So therefore, arms race was not an option for India. India had to basically concentrate on economic development, and therefore it is not just a chance that India gave the slogan at that time of disarmament against arms race. And disarmament at that time implied that if the world basically diverts its resources from arms race to development through the mechanism of disarmament, then basically large number of people on this globe would basically become more happier. So this was basically the slogan which India gave at that time, and this slogan was not only on account of its ideological commitment for peace and non-violence, as we mentioned that it was India's traditional legacy, but it was also on account of India's national interest. It was a realist basically assessment of India's problem. And it is here one can say that India's foreign policy of non-alignment was based on the correct assessment of the global situation. So one can say that non-alignment was not simply ideological commitment of global peace, order, non-violence or democracy, but it was also a reflection of India's priorities in terms of its economic needs and so many other social constraints. So therefore, this is how India started its journey as a post-colonial state. Now, India's India's foreign policy in the formative years was truly non-aligned. India didn't want to tilt either towards one camp or the other, and result was that both superpowers suspected India. They didn't trust India. They thought, the British Americans thought that the fight was between totalitarianism and democracy, and India was not standing with democracy. Therefore, India's commitment for democracy was not foolproof, or India's commitment for democracy was suspect. On the other hand, Soviet Union believed that the fight was between imperialism and those who were fighting imperialist forces, and India was basically pursuing the path of non-alignment. Therefore, India's credential as anti-imperialist force was also suspect. And therefore, the two superpowers suspected India's credentials as a truly non-aligned country, because for them, non-alignment was simply a policy to escape from the reality. But that was not true. In fact, India, in a true sense, believed in policy of non-alignment. And not only India, but many countries gradually started believing in the same principle. And it is not just a chance that in course of time, the popularity of this non-aligned movement reflected this fact, and India became a leader. Of course, when formally this non-aligned movement was launched in 1961 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, India, and Egypt, the Nasir, Tito and Nehru, the three names which are normally remembered when we talk of non-aligned movement and the beginning of non-aligned movement, 1961. Indonesia, another important member of this bloc, and gradually the more and more powers, the third world countries, the developing countries, started coming on this bandwagon, largely on account of the fact that they also saw the similar threat which India had seen earlier, coming from this new power rivalry which was going on in name of Cold War. Now, what happened that India perhaps valued two, three things at that time. One was India's own concern, that was development. Another thing which also India valued was autonomy in decision making, the freedom which perhaps India loved quite much, because as you know that India had suffered on account of colonial rule, and India had got or attained this independence after long struggle, and therefore India didn't want this freedom to be lost again, and India wanted to basically retain that freedom or autonomy in decision making. And joining Cold War at that time meant that India would not be positioned to take autonomous decision on issues, because joining a camp meant basically subjugating oneself to one camp or the other. And therefore, India valued autonomy, India valued freedom, India basically prioritizes economic development, and all these things necessitated that India pursued a different policy other than what we had seen earlier in name of Cold War. So, it is the context, it is in this context that we should remember the post-colonial state in India basically going for or formulating its foreign policy. Of course, this foreign policy which India decided had its domestic component also, and this is what we normally refer to as a mixed economy, that India neither followed purely this Western liberal democratic model in which this entire Western Europe or United States of America or their allies believed in. That is basically a kind of market economy. On the other hand, India also didn't purely go for that kind of model which Soviet Union had practiced, in spite of the fact that India went for a planned economic development, a state controlled economy, but that existed side by side with a democratic system, which India started in spite of many adverse conditions existing at that time for democracy as it is normally understood in liberal sense. For example, India didn't have industrialized base, India didn't have a very high level of literacy, India had a lot of diversity. Of course, gradually this diversity has been considered to be great value for democracy, but at that time it was not the case. So, in spite of those adverse conditions, India had gone for democracy with this planned economic development, which was to some extent one can say inspired by the Soviet model and so on and so forth. So, therefore, it was a kind of a mixed situation which has been understood as a mixed economy where you had the state as well as certain elements of the Western liberal trajectory of development. So, therefore, in fact, this at the international level we had this policy at the third route that is non-alignment. On domestically also we are going for a different route, that one can say as a third route. So that was the uniqueness of this post-colonial foreign policy of India. Now 50s went like this. Of course, lot of challenges. India believed in United Nations. India believed in global order. India believed in global governance. India wholeheartedly participated in all the actions and all the missions of United Nations, including during the Korean War and so on and so forth. India basically participated in peacekeeping measures of United Nations. But in spite of that, United Nations at that time was also becoming a kind of arena in which the Cold War politics was being played. So therefore, India didn't expect much from the global institutions, and it is in this context that when non-aligned movement was started in 1961, the slogan of a new international economic order, and not only new international economic order, but India's demand for democratization of all global institutions, all including United Nations and its Security Council, can also be seen in this perspective. That India on the one hand believed in global peace, India on the other also wanted the global institutions like United Nations to be democratized, so that the voices of less developed countries like India could be heard there. And when non-aligned movement was basically started, continuously India was raising, India along with all non-aligned countries were raising these issues, that is the democratization of these bodies as well as the creation of a new international economic order in place of this Bretton Woods system, which came into existence of the Second World War. And these countries thought that Bretton Woods institutions were lauded in favor of the developed countries, and therefore this North-South dialogue in name of this new international economic order, which was also going on, didn't satisfy countries like India, because they thought that rules of the game were tilting in favor of the developed nations, not the developing ones. So this is how India at that time was placed in terms of its foreign policy, that was trying to augment its power at the home, on domestic front, because after all international relations, in spite of lot of ideological differing positions, one thing is very clear, that ultimately it is power which makes difference, it is power which matters. And that's why a lot of people believe that realism or the realist approach to international politics always have a day. But nonetheless, idealism has its own value, and that value can be seen in context of India's foreign policy, because at that time India didn't have any element of power as it is understood in international relations. India was not a developed economy. India didn't have the nuclear capability. India was cannot be considered from any point of view as a powerful nation, the way power is understood and defined in international relations. But in spite of that, India commanded tremendous respect in the Committee of Nations, so much so that gradually India emerged as the leader of non-aligned countries, and therefore non-alignment as a principle substituted the absence of the real power which India had. And therefore many scholars have of late started believing that non-alignment can be seen as a soft power. In fact, if India didn't have the hard power, as if we make a comparison between hard power or normal power and the soft power, and today it is universally acknowledged that the both powers are required to complement each other. Even if you have a hard power, even then you require the soft power to support it. And India didn't have hard power. India only uses soft power to basically leverage its position in international arena. The kind of respect which India commanded at that time was largely on account of its commitment to certain principles and ideology, and though they were basically this peace, non-violence, democracy, and so on and so forth. So it became a substitute for India's absence of power, or India's lack of power. It rather complemented it, or one can say supplemented it. In course of time, India's stature grew, but that didn't alter the situation which existed on the domestic front. India's economy, of course, it started with lot of fanfare in 40s, in 50s. After this planning and other things started, 50s went like this. Cold War continued. India's leadership was trying to negotiate a number of problems, but 60s was a period of some despondency. And of course, domestically also one can say that India was struggling against many odds. There was turmoil, social turmoil. There was basically a kind of pessimism gripping India at that time, the kind of optimism on which India had started after freedom. That optimism did not last long, and number of problems we can find coming to the fore in 60s, the central state relations, the language problem, the ethnic strife, you have deteriorating conditions of economic conditions of people, the working people. In fact, in agriculture the situation was not quite heartening. Industrial development was also not up to the mark, and it was largely on account of the fact that India had to revisit its entire strategy in 60s. In the meanwhile, one major setback happened in 1962, and that was a Chinese aggression. The India's reverses at the hands of China was a wake-up call so far as security is concerned. Now, if one talks of security as two-pronged, in two, from the point of view of two different dimensions, one is the material security, another is the physical security, then even the physical security got exposed. The material security, as I was mentioning, this entire discourse on development and other things was also struggling. All basically one can say, but the physical security got exposed with Chinese aggression, because the kind of defense preparedness India had was not up to the mark, and therefore it was a wake-up call. Of course, the Chinese reverses, the Chinese aggression and the kind of setback India faced had a lot of other dimensions which is not possible to discuss here in this lecture. But one thing is very clear, that India in basically under the spell of idealism did not believe that Asian country would basically behave like this. India did not expect China to invade. India was the first country which recognized China after 1949 revolution. India even pleaded for its permanent membership in Security Council. India thought that India had an old basically bond with China, and therefore China was its valued neighbor. But the differences gradually cropped up in spite of having these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that is called Panchashil, which was formulated in 1954 basically on Tibet. So therefore, in spite of this Panchashil, China invaded, and that exposed India's security. So it was a wake-up call. So basically on physical security, India's got exposed. On material security, the earlier strategy was not delivering, and therefore the 60s was a period for rethinking, revisiting its priorities and its framework so far as foreign policy is concerned. Now, what happened when Chinese aggression took place, when India's physical security got exposed? India basically wanted some sort of commitment from the two superpowers for India's security, but both superpowers basically cold-shouldered India, because they thought that India pursued a policy of non-alignment and therefore it should fend for itself. And that was also a wake-up call, and this entire thing continued. Of course, 64 Nehru died. He was followed by his successor Shastri, and Lal Bahadur Shastri. In fact, when he was the prime minister, he also faced some problem on account of PL 480, particularly the supply of wheat from United States of America. It was in this context that he had to give the slogan of Jai Jawan and Jai Kisan, which symbolize the two elements of this security discourse, the physical as well as material. If the Jawan symbolizes physical security, this Kisan symbolize the material security. Therefore, this basically tells us that how India faced a problem on both fronts, the physical security and the material security in 60s, because earlier strategy of 50s was showing its limitation. Of course, Shastri's tenure as Prime Minister was short-lived, but he played important role in steering the country in a difficult situation. Now, 60s therefore was a turbulent period for India, both domestically and global internationally, and therefore India's foreign policy passed through a testing time. Now, it is not just a chance that a foreign observer on India, Sally Harrison, called that 60s as a dangerous decade. That is perhaps the title of his book, famous book. So therefore, Shastri, we find that after he had a short tenure as Prime Minister, was succeeded by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who to some extent initially continued Shastri's policy, but later on she took to altogether different trajectory so far foreign policy is concerned. Now, Indira Gandhi's tenure as a Prime Minister, which continued till 1984, with of course breaks in between, particularly between 77 to 80, was marked with a number of developments, and one of the most significant development of that period was basically radicalization of non-aligned movement, because in Nehru's time people believed that it was truly non-aligned. India was truly non-aligned. It didn't tilt either in direction or in towards United States or Soviet Union, and perhaps that was the reason that both superpowers didn't trust India. But during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time as a Prime Minister, we find that non-aligned movement as a whole got radicalized. When we say radicalized, then basically what scholars in international relations and experts on foreign policy, they argue that foreign policy of India along with this entire non-aligned movement which India was leading at that time tilted in favor of Soviet Union, because what happened that Soviet Union from the very beginning was making this point that some of the concerns of non-aligned movement basically were similar to the concerns of Soviet Union. So far imperialism, racism, colonialism and other things are concerned. They said that we have no problem in accepting this thing that the third world countries are the victim of colonialism, and therefore the colonial rulers owe an explanation, or rather should compensate for it. But they said that it was not Soviet Union or earlier its predecessor, that is Russia, who had colonized them. Therefore it was largely this America and its allies who were responsible for the underdeveloped of the developing countries. And secondly, they also believed that Soviet Union was fighting imperialism and imperialist forces, and therefore non-aligned movement when talked of anti-racism, anti-colonialism, new international economic order, disarmament and so on and so forth, all of them basically resonated what Soviet Union stood for, or basically what Soviet Union always spoke for. So therefore, in fact, this is what they used to say. But in spite of that, so non-aligned movement was keeping equidistance from the both superpowers and this camp rivalry during the Cold War. This continued till 60s, till end of 60s. But gradually this non-aligned movement started getting radicalized, and particularly radicalized in the sense that anti-West, and it tilted in direction of Soviet Union. And two developments are normally cited: induction of Cuba as a new member of non-aligned movement who had openly, or one can say that it was camp follower of Soviet Union under Fidel Castro, and number two, that 1971 the friendship, peace and Indo-USSR Treaty for Peace and Friendship. This treaty was also questioned by many countries, that how India could claim to be non-aligned when it was having such treaty with one superpower in context of the Cold War rivalry. But India defended it. It said that it had nothing to do with the Cold War politics. It was a treaty for peace and friendship. So basically, apart from this treaty also, we find that a kind of close collaboration which took place between Soviet Union and India. And this is not a coincidence that even on domestic policies, we find a lot of basically tilt in direction of a new type of ideological politics which Mrs. Gandhi was spearheading at that time. In fact, she aligned with the forces on the left in the India. At the same time, the kind of economic strategy which was chalked out. In fact, earlier it was, if it was this planned economy during the Nehru's time, then now what India witnessed was the license permit laws, the clear cut state sponsored or state monitored or state intervention in economy. The kind of space which was earlier given for private capital also got shrunk, and therefore state presence in economy increased manifold. And therefore domestically also one can say that Mrs. Gandhi's policy perhaps suited this international tilt which India as well as this non-aligned movement was having in direction of Soviet Union. And therefore a lot of people believe that non-aligned movement as a whole got radicalized. Of course, there are a lot of voices of dissent, but the dominant voices of course basically spoke in unison. Basically they talked in the same language, that is anti-West and the pro-Soviet. So therefore this is how India's foreign policy was placed in 70. But then there were other challenges, as I mentioned, on domestic front, because foreign policy cannot remain insulated from the domestic challenges in domestic policies. For example, as I mentioned, that when India was struggling in 60s on issue of food production or the food security, when Lal Bahadur Shastri gave the slogan of Jai Jawan Jai Kisan, it was around that time that new strategy in agriculture was chalked out. This is known as Green Revolution. Green Revolution resulted in kind of self-sufficiency in food grains, particularly wheat and other things, of course in certain pockets of the country. But then there were other problems which also emerged around the same time. The kind of disparities which increased in society, the inequalities, the poverty ratio it was going up, and therefore these concerns had to be addressed, because that was also leading to some sort of extremism in society. And during that period that we have had a lot of instances of kind of militancy in the countryside, and therefore what happens that a massive anti-poverty measures were launched on behalf of the state. So in fact the kind of late 60s and early 70s, many anti-poverty measures India witnessed, from NREP, IRDP, and many such schemes were launched at different period, but they were essentially meant to address this growing disparity and inequality in the countryside. So in fact on the question of self-sufficiency in food grains, in terms of addressing the concern of inequality and disparity, in terms of addressing the concern of central state disparities, that is central state relations, and many other issues, ethnic and other strife which was also basically materializing at that time, all of them had to be addressed if India was really interested in surging ahead through its economic strategy, through its foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And if India was interested in regaining or basically attaining a new place among the community of nations. So this is how India revisited its concerns, its priorities, and its entire framework of foreign policy. 70s went like this, but in fact 70s of course was interrupted by certain other developments on domestic front, that was emergency, then the coming to the power for the first time a non-Congress government, which also gave the slogan of a genuine non-alignment, because they thought that under Mrs. Indira Gandhi, India's non-alignment had tilted towards Soviet Union. Therefore, this genuine non-alignment had to be framework for genuine non-alignment had to be created. But nonetheless, we find that there were not major changes in foreign policy priorities or concerns, because one thing is very clear, that foreign policy often reflects the consensus in the society, the consensus among various ideological groups, consensus among various political parties in democracy. Domestically, they may quarrel, they may disagree on number of issues, but on foreign policy issues, normally we find that there is a broad consensus. And this can be borne out by the fact that when 1977 a non-Congress government came to power, so far the foreign policy priorities were concerned, they were not changed much, and therefore there was a continuity, in spite of the fact that this slogan of genuine non-alignment was given by the Janta government. But of course, little amount of liberalization in economy we can find taking place, which of course a lot of people believe that started little earlier, but with 77 we can definitely see some sign of liberalization in economy, because the kind of license permit Raj or a stranglehold of the state which was there on the economy, that was little bit loosened. But then what happened? 1980 Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power, but 1980 coincides with another important international development, that is basically the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this is something very significant, because what happened that this Soviet invasion in Afghanistan brought the Cold War on India's doors, on India's backyard. What happened that before this Soviet invasion, there were 2-3 important developments which also impacted India considerably so far foreign policy of a post-colonial state is concerned. And one shouldn't forget that 1971 India fought a war with Pakistan, and after 1962 aggression, which exposed India's material, at least physical security, and gradually India's material security also got exposed when this PL 480 and other controversies erupted. 1971 war was a kind of a triumphant moment for India's foreign policy, because India not only won the war, but also basically forced Pakistan to enter into that Simla pact or Simla Accord and Simla agreement, under which this Kashmir was declared a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, because Pakistan consistently was trying to internationalize and globalize Kashmir, because they thought that India had taken this matter to United Nations, and United Nations had passed a resolution, therefore it was an international matter to be addressed. But this Simla Accord between India and Pakistan after 1971 debacle of Pakistan in the war, it was a triumphant moment for India, because this became a bilateral issue as per this accord. Of course, Pakistan kept on violating this spirit and keeps violating it even today. But nonetheless, this was a triumphant moment, that is 71 war. And one shouldn't forget here the significance of this Indo-Soviet Treaty for Peace and Friendship, because largely on account of that treaty, that Soviet Union, which in spite of India not being part of their Cold War camp, in fact came openly in support of India, both in United Nations Security Council, when United States of America was trying to pass a resolution against India and declaring it to be aggressor. And not only that, even when India was exposed to nuclear blackmail by United States of America in Indian Ocean on account of the movement of the 7th Fleet, it was a Soviet intervention, as is believed by scholars, that prevented any such blackmail. Of course, there are different accounts now available of that episode. United States of America defend that USA was never interested in intervening in that war. It was simply meant to deter India from taking this aggression any further or dismembering Pakistan. But of course, there are different accounts of that story. But one thing is very clear, that 71 war and the success in that war, Indo-Pak war, the Simla Accord, and this declaration of making Kashmir a bilateral issue, and subsequently 1974 Pokhran explosion, the Pokhran 1, which was declared as Buddha Smiles, this operation, because it was for peaceful purposes. Buddha is symbol of peace, and the Pokhran was also made the symbol of peace, that India was going for this nuclear option, but only for peaceful purposes, not for weaponization or any other thing. Because India believed at that time that India's nuclear option was a compulsion, not a luxury, because India's neighbors, particularly one neighbor, China, had declared itself a nuclear power, and therefore India had refused signing this NPT of 1968, because India believed that it was discriminatory treaty. India, as a matter of principle, believed that nuclear weapons, if they were declared illegal, India would be the first country to sign it. But unless there is a universal disarmament, unless there is a in principle nuclear weapons are declared illegal, it would be very unethical on part of any country to force India to sign a discriminatory treaty like NPT, and therefore India refused to sign it, and India retained this right to go nuclear. Though in principle India always said that India didn't believe in violence, India didn't believe in nuclear weapons, India didn't believe in war as an instrument of foreign policy. So this is what we basically know about India's position so far as the NPT is concerned. India stuck to it. But 74, India went for this nuclear test, largely because India thought that after Chinese aggression, India's security got exposed, and the two superpowers and the big powers were not ready to basically take the responsibility of India's security vis-a-vis China. And therefore, it got exposed, and India had to address this concern. And India started addressing this concern gradually as a post-colonial state who was always short of resources, but even mobilized its own resources to basically streamline its research, particularly in science and technology, and moved in direction of self-sufficiency and self-reliance so far as defense preparedness and defense technology is concerned. So this Pokhran 1 was basically symbol of that. So therefore, after 60s, as we mentioned, the situation of gloom, we really moved to 70s, where we have many triumphant moments from 71 onwards. On the front of domestic front, particularly the economic situation, I have mentioned that there were signs of recovery, there were signs of revival, there were signs of optimism, but nonetheless there are many issues required to be addressed. And this is how we moved to 80s, particularly from 77 to 80, you had Danta government talking of genuine non-alignment, little bit of liberalization, and so on and so forth. 80, Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power, and therefore we find that again, IT starts with 79 Soviet invasion to Afghanistan. The Cold War comes to India's backyard, rather in India's door, and India was now basically willy-nilly was caught in this struggle. Now, of course, the Soviet invasion was in long-term perspective became quite detrimental to India's national interest, because Soviet invasion in Afghanistan meant that United States of America also took to some hard measures to counter Soviet expansionism, and this is how this entire radicalization or extremism or terrorism, as you know, basically developed in South Asia, because United States of America erected a new force to counter Soviet presence in Afghanistan, and this is what we know as Mujahideens. And this radicalization in name of religion, which was basically promoted by United States of America, which later on boomeranged on it, of course, was on account of this new development in Cold War politics. So therefore, India had to concentrate on its security and other issues, because Pakistan, of course, was part of this Cold War politics of United States, and United States of America started arming Pakistan to its teeth to counter Soviet presence in Afghanistan. So this is how India also had to concentrate on its defense and its armaments. Therefore, the concerns of development, because the moment you have to concentrate on your defense preparedness, some amount of resources definitely get diverted from development. And from the very beginning, India's priority was development. So this is how we find that 80s moved on. But by 89-90, India was in throes of a crisis, and this is what basically is quite important here. Now 89 onwards, particularly 91, India had a major balance of payment crisis, and that was basically the background in which India had to revisit all its concerns, all its basically entire framework of foreign policy, because as I mentioned very beginning, that domestic factors always impinge on foreign policy, and therefore this new economic crisis coincided with many new developments, including the end of Cold War, disintegration of Soviet Union, the transformation of the entire world into a unipolar situation. Scholars have started debating that what was the nature and character of the world, whether it was unipolar or multipolar. But one fact no one could contest, that United States of America emerged as the most powerful country. And India, the relationship United States of America was not always quite cordial. Therefore, India is in a very adverse situation. On the one hand, India had to look for assistance outside, particularly World Bank and IMF, which were basically controlled by these Western powers. On the other hand, what India discovered, that the Western countries led by United States of America, which emerged triumphant after the collapse of Soviet Union and the victory in the Gulf War, they started tightening noose around many countries whom they declared as threshold countries so far as nuclear weapons is concerned. And India was included in that list. And therefore, the three issues which were at the center of this new agenda before these big powers at that time, one was nuclear weapons, another was human rights and similar concerns, and the third was the trade liberalization. And all three issues India found itself completely hard pressed, and this is how India had to negotiate with a new situation. And it was this challenging moment that India had a Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao, and who is often credited for basically sailing through very turbulent period quite competently. Because what happens that he crafted many new policies, like Look East policy, that not only we should rely on the Western allies and Western friends, but we should also mobilize our traditional linkages with the Eastern countries, Southeast Asia and Asia. He also basically negotiated with the West for economic recovery. At the same time, he didn't abandon his nuclear entire project, which India under the leadership of so many earlier prime ministers was basically continuing. So this is how this prepared the background for a new foreign policy initiative in 90s. And therefore, when we talk of aspiring power, because today if India is aspiring to be a global power in terms of its economic strength, the growth rate, because many scholars are predicting that India will overtake China, or India as a de facto nuclear country in spite of not being recognized as a nuclear nation, which has a nuclear power but still has a nuclear capability, or a country as India's Prime Minister, today's Prime Minister Narendra Modi often says that India has three things: democracy, demand and demographic dividends, the three things which no other country has, and therefore it has an aspiration to become a global power. This aspiration has been created by the 6 decades of India's foreign policy. This is how we have to understand the journey of a post-colonial to aspiring power. I will stop here.
Okay, friends, I hope you found this lecture to be as enriching, as informative as I have found it. And on that note, I would like to thank Sir for this lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.